After losing two key members in the mid to late 70s, Genesis tosses out the old playbook and charts a new path forward as a trio. We're talking about their 1980 album, Duke. Stay with us.
Get ready for the 3324 podcast, where lifelong friends Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber share their love of all things music and movies. Dean has directed short films and is a music trivia buff. And Eric, trained in audio engineering, brings his extensive knowledge of music and film to the conversation as they discuss, debate, and celebrate their favorite albums, films, and much more.
Welcome one and all to the 3324 podcast. If you're new, thank you so much for joining us. If you're a returner, thank you as well. We appreciate it. 2025 is here. We've got a whole great grand slate of material for you. We haven't figured it out yet, but we know it's going to be grand and great, Eric, right? Because
absolutely. New year,
grand and great.
New sights to new goals. Yeah.
Same
onward
old
and upward, right? As that's what we're always saying.
Same old tired hosts.
We're not getting any younger, but hopefully,
but a little wiser with every.
Yeah, a little wise. Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
thank you for Clark. Thank you for swooping in with the save and
there you go,
and lifting us back up again out of our tired bones and sagging flesh bags that we occupy. Anyway, enough of the depressing stuff. Yeah,
Happy New Year.
You know what?
We'll happy fucking New Year.
Yeah, hey, 2025.
But gotta keep a positive attitude, man. We have to. We always do. Yep,
we always do. It's a little self-deprecation humor that we throw at you, but we appreciate checking in with us every week. And if you do, or when you hear something you like, or you see a title you like, we appreciate that. We appreciate that. We love spending time with you. We love talking about music and movies and having guests on and just kind of tossing these ideas around and rediscovering music too, which was one of the big things that I've gotten out of this is able to rediscover music or listen to music that I hadn't listened to before and check it out. So if you hadn't heard, our guest, Mr. Christopher Clark, is with us for another album from 1980. He had done Zenyatta Mondatta a little while ago.
That's right. Yeah.
For another survey of 1980 stuff. Yep. So there's a little trend. So welcome aboard, Christopher. How are you?
Good to be here. I'm doing well, and I'm really excited to do this record.
Yeah. I kind of got ganged up on this one, to be honest. We toss around. I ask people. I ask obviously Eric. Is sends me his list because that's the stuff we mainly discuss. Is like what try and meter it out. And then I said to Chris, I said, hey, send me a list, and he sent me Jesus.
Yeah, I went a little crazy.
He sent me a list. He sent me the whole.
He's got a list of as long as my leg right now. Because I'm like, wow.
I'm thinking of which different directions you guys are going to go, and I'm trying to. I feel like I boxed myself in as the Prog guy. So
he covered us and about 6 other podcasts. What he did. But buried in both of their lists was one word, and it was Duke. Okay, and I don't think they meant Duke Ellington. I was guessing that they meant this album from Genesis called Duke. So we're gonna. So both of them are on it, and I actually want to quiz both of you guys about this as well, about why it was on your list, and it kept coming up on lists as well. I think Eric had it a couple times, but we'll get into it. Let's get the stats out of the way, and then we'll dig into this very unique and interesting album and some stuff that I came to realize and appreciate about Genesis after reading about Duke and diving into it a little bit more than I had in the past. Anyway, this was released in March of 1980, produced by Genesis and David Henschel. There were 2 singles stateside. Was Misunderstanding, hit number 14, and their perennial show opener, if you've ever seen them, Turn It On Again, hit number 58. Not very good, but 14 was good for them. Hit number 11 on Billboard. It only went 1 times platinum, which is 1 million copies. But for these guys at this point, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Since Genesis was that art rock thing that people kept at arm's distance, weird, artsy, strange, definitely a big following, but not a big chart following. They had their loyal rabid fans for this type of music, but that didn't always translate into chart hits. What?
Chris and I are part of that group.
Absolutely, 100%.
So let me start right out of the gate. Is why? And I think Chris was I think Chris has mentioned Duke a few times. I know Eric, it's always on Eric's list. So let me kick it over to Chris first, and then to Eric. Why specifically Duke? What is it about this album that you guys keep mentioning?
So for me, like one of my earliest memories as a kid is my dad in his closet had a crate of records. And when I first started getting into music, I would like flip through it to see. And the thing that would draw me into what I would listen to would be the covers. And the first thing I ever remember about Duke was pulling it out of that crate and looking at the cover that almost looked like a cartoon, almost looked like Ziggy to some extent, like that, you know, the style of drawing.
If you're watching on YouTube, I'm holding it up so you can kind of see that. Check it out there.
And my dad, you know, he in the 80s, he did listen to a lot of 80s music. You know, he was in his 20s for most of the 80s. So the thing I remember is like listening to Turn It On Again. And then as I got into music, I got very into like prog stuff, particularly in high school. I had a teacher in high school who was my choir teacher, who was very into prog. My dad was into prog. And then I started going down the wormhole of like ELP and Yes. And then I started to listen to a little bit of Genesis. And I was always told that if you're going to listen to Genesis as a prog fan, this is where you stop. But I listened to it. But the thing that always drew me in to this record more than anything else was that opening cut. And it's Behind the Lines, and Phil Collins is drumming on this record like he's a monster, and he was a monster on the records in the 70s, but like this is like I feel like one of his shining moments as far as like Genesis is concerned, because I feel like this is his and Tony Banks's album, and that's what draws me to this record is really Phil Collins' both vocal and instrumental performances on this album, and I think the writing is really well done. And I know the last few times I've been on, when we did Zeppelin, when we did The Police, we keep talking about a pivot record. To me, this is a pivot record, like you said, or even Queen, when we talked about Queen. Like if you're going to go, this is the record where you can go back and it'll make sense if you listen to like this Peter Gabriel, Steve Hackett stuff, but it'll also make sense if you go forward to like Abacab and Genesis and Invisible Touch. So to me, it's really the best. It's kind of encapsulates what's really good about the prog era, but also before it got a little too cheesy, like what's really cool about the 80s synth and more art rock type stuff than the prog stuff.
Cool. Now you mentioned a lot of things that are in my notes that we're going to unpack also. So there was a lot in there that you mentioned that I want to talk about for people that are just know the trio Genesis thing. We're not going to go deep into the backstory, but like I said in the open, there were two things that happened that were pretty significant, and they happened relatively quickly in the scope of the band. So now, Eric, obviously, you know, if you've been with us since day one, episode two was Face Value, or episode 3 of our podcast. So we were what was one of the ones that we were hitting from the beginning as the resident Phil Collins Genesis fan. But is it because it's that era where Phil was starting to break out, or what is it for you about Duke that kind of puts it in that special place?
Well, to piggyback what Chris was saying, my first album was Abacab, which, by and large, I mean, it was an interesting album to get into at the time because it was, right smack when it just came out. So I'm sort of glad for that. I got into Genesis at kind of like the right time. But of course, then, Face Value, How Long Must Be Going, all that, all of those things came out at roughly the same time. Duke was the album that came before. I mean, I think the only thing that kept it at arm's length for me was, by and large, the production of it. It was kind of dry. Abacab, I drew to Abacab because of because of that great production by Hugh Padgham. And
that's his first one with them too, right?
Right. It was a great sounding album, and I love the sound of the drums, and and it just really hit me. This was a little bit more, drier, perhaps more in the studio. It was there. I mean, the seeds were sown for the sort of pop stuff to come. But yes, like Chris was saying, There's a lot of that prog stuff happening on this record. I mean, Tony's still playing a friggin', Mellotron on this record, which I think is phenomenal, combined with synth and, all this kind of stuff. So it is definitely this sort of retro futuristic album that you get a little bit of both. And of course, probably one of the most important things about it is the fact that Phil is now an equal partner in the sense that he's now a songwriter. Mm-hmm. So he contributed a couple of tracks himself to the mix, which Tony and Mike, they liked the fact that Phil knew how to write a 4-minute song, whereas that wasn't their forte. They was just more or less, they were, if you're a Genesis fan, the story, like they can't write anything under 5 minutes.
Supper's ready.
Exactly. So, and I think because of that, I think that, Phil definitely, I think must have had some kind of an influence, because there are shorter songs by Tony and Mike on this record. So they all kind of had a hand in delving into that kind of songwriting. And I think it for me would be the album that I would recommend to somebody who wants to understand Genesis and what they're about. I would definitely put this there and say, check this one out. Because if you're interested in the proggy stuff and the musicianship on this record, then you can go further back. If you're into the sort of like the songwriting, the more going forward in the 80s, if you like that kind of thing, if you were a big fan of like just, pop ditties of the 80s, this is the direction that they would go. This album really kind of it's that, but it's brilliant.
It's the Hinge album.
The Hinge album. It's a brilliant combination. Really, yeah. So what we've got is, and you brought up a lot of stuff too. So just to kind of clear the air of the back stuff, in 1975, Peter Gabriel, who was the leader of Genesis, he was literally the face or the many faces of Genesis, for better or for worse, and much sometimes to the chagrin of the other members, felt like they were backing bands to Peter Gabriel. He leaves in 1975 for a multitude of reasons. Some were personal, some were musical, mostly personal. Mm-hmm. That brings them down to a quartet of Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Phil Collins, and Steve Hackett, who was the lead guitarist. Mm-hmm. Mike Rutherford was a guitarist, but mainly would play bass and kind of backup guitar, not really a lead and not to the level of Steve Hackett. Steve Hackett was the virtuoso. Yes. So in 77, right when they released their live album Seconds Out, Steve Hackett's like, this isn't for me. But, I feel like my ideas are not coming across. You guys are trying to close ranks, basically, right? Because they wanted to not continue to be the Genesis that was. This was a conscious effort and a conscious decision. And Steve Hackett's like, well, this isn't going to work for me. Yeah.
So he takes a powder and he leaves in 77. So that really, within 2 years, you go from a 5-piece to a 3-piece, and your lead singer and your main guitarist leaves. Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, any other band that would be like, I don't even know.
That's the end.
It would be like Brian Johnson and Angus Young leaving AC/DC.
Yeah.
I guess. Right. And you're left with the three guys that, that's what you're left with. Right. So they decide, what, we're going to soldier on. We think we've got the talent to continue to write songs. And what we're going to do is, we don't want to do the fantasy, the elves in the woods and the sci-fi. Mm-hmm. We want to just write regular songs. And they started to do that with the previous album before that. And then there were 3 was them kind of launching the new Genesis. And here's our ideas. We're not going to turn our back on that stuff, but we're going to move forward in a different way. And Mike Rutherford is like, they thought about getting other guitarists, and Mike Rutherford's like, I think I'm going to step up to the challenge. He's no Steve Hackett, but that brings that automatically changes the recipe. If you're not trying to replace a virtuoso, Eric, right? But you've got someone who's, and I think that's what figures into this album and going forward is Mike Rutherford's bass playing, I think, informs his guitar playing. I think they kind of, especially on this album, there are bass runs that he's doubling with his guitar, and that gives it a more funky edge.
I agree. He kind of was the rhythm guitar player. What Hackett was full on, but what Mike brings to the table on both, and then there were 3 in this album, to me, is he's not trying to play lead. He's trying to give the songs that those flourishes that are needed. And I find that to be in a very interesting way to play guitar. I actually like that. I mean, that type of guitar playing, I'm a big fan of anyway. Textures and just little, it serves the song. It's not, he's not trying to be a virtuoso, right? So
he finds the moments to get in there and do something interesting with it, but also using his bass. Chris, what do you got?
I was going to say, the one criticism I actually like when when you emailed me about doing this record, I kind of do a little like research and I do like internet jumps and that kind of stuff. And the one criticism I read in like I forget, it was a message board or a Reddit or something, that if you're a Genesis fan that comes from the 70s, the one thing you miss on this and on this record and the previous one, and then there were 3, is the absence of Steve Hackett.
Yeah.
Which I can understand if you're coming to Genesis for the guitar, but I also think what makes Duke so cool is that, and again, I love Steve. I've seen him 4 or 5 times, but what I think makes this record so cool is that because Hackett isn't there, it allows the keyboards to be more prevalent in a very cool and interesting way. And I kept going back and forth. I'm like, Phil Collins and Tony Banks, really, this is their like album where they really shine. But then you really stop and think about it. You really don't realize what a great bass player Mike Rutherford really is.
Yeah.
Because not that you don't hear the bass on the 70s records, but like because Hackett is there, you're not paying as much attention to what it is Mike Rutherford is really doing, which is very cool.
And I think there's no better. I'm sorry, Dean. There's no better album to really get that sense. Is for me the Criminally underrated, and then there were 3. Listen to the rhythm of Phil.
Yeah, it's a great record.
On that record it'll blow your mind what they're doing on that stuff, and it shows that they actually had those chops. That's some virtuosic playing. In my opinion, it's just as good as any other band of that ilk. But they decided not to do that, right? Yeah. It's that conscious decision of, we don't want to do that. We want to write songs. We want to compose interesting music. We're not trying to outplay each other in that sense. So
yeah, and it's interesting that each time these opportunities came up, they opted not to replace people.
Yeah, right.
They said, well, at first they were going to replace Gabriel, but then they're like, oh, Phil's close enough. He's kind of got the same tone. He can sing it. And then they thought about replacing Steve Hackett. And actually, I was just reading a nugget from Steve Hackett after he quit. Phil Collins was driving to the studio and he saw Steve Hackett walking down the street.
Yep, I read that too. Yeah,
offered him a ride, and Steve Hackett was like, "No, I don't want to ride." And Phil didn't know that he had left.
Yeah,
and Steve Hackett said, "If I got in that car, Phil Collins is the one person that could have talked me back into reconsidering."
That's Phil, because
it's a good thing that and that's what made me respect Genesis, or not respect it because I always respected them, but really made it very interesting that they're making these decisions. And then they said, yeah, all 3 of us are going to write together. So for Duke, each one brought 2 songs that they had written and then collaborated on the rest.
Yeah, right? A lot of it came from jamming.
Yeah. It was kind of like, here's what I have, and then we'll work on the rest, which really, you tend to think of, when Phil Collins is in the band, that he's taking up all the air. But they really did strive to keep that collaborative effort of, when we're with Genesis, Phil Collins tries his best to slot in as a member of Genesis. As difficult as it got later on in the 80s, Genesis was on board with that, though. That this was what they wanted to do. We want to make shorter songs. We want to make stuff that's more accessible and explore that kind of songwriting thing. And each one of them is up to the challenge. They each have particular songwriting strengths and weaknesses. And on Duke, I think you get a nice kind of cross section of what each one brings, and then the stuff that they worked on. The only qualm I have, and let me ask whoever wants to answer it, is this was supposed to be kind of a concept album, but it's not a concept album.
No.
Right?
No.
What they wanted to do was to make a suite. One side was supposed to be pieced together with Behind the Lines, Duchess, guide vocal, Turn It On Again, and then Duke's Travels and Duke's End as one long piece. The thing that I find, that they decided not to do that, and yet they wrote songs that musically I think would fit into that vein of the sort of proggy kind of feel, like Cul-de-sac and Man of Our Times definitely has that. You could definitely see those songs being sort of inserted in that. And I think the reason they wrote those songs the way they did is to balance the album out, was to have like, kind of that multi-layered kind of thing. And then, Phil comes in with Misunderstanding and it just comes out of nowhere. It's like, you got all this kind of, this big, freaking thing, like in the beginning, like this introduction of this big thing. And then of course, Misunderstanding comes in. It's like, it's totally out of left field, but it works. Yeah. I think it, works just fine, but yeah, I mean, like that was the thing. But the thing that I discovered about this record, and especially nowadays, it's the album does have a similar theme running through it. I think it's nothing but a big lament of things.
Yeah. Yep.
It is Phil losing his marriage. His marriage is gone. Love lost. He's lamenting that. He's lamenting not seeing his kids all the time. It's Tony Banks with Heat Haze writing about people destroying the environment. It's an end of an era as well, musically speaking. And there's several like lines of songs that you kind of get that feel, like especially in Duchess and things like Cul-de-sac, and where they're actually saying this, and so to me, it is kind of piecing that concept, or that pushing that theme forward. They're saying goodbye to one thing and moving on to another. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely got a melancholy feel to it. Not necessarily sad, but this kind of overtone. But before I kick it over to Chris, there's a certain energy, like when Behind the Lines starts, because I went back and I kind of listened to a little bit of And There Were Three. I just like to compare. There is an energy that this album opens with Behind the Lines that is something different. I think that's what Chris was like. Phil's drumming is it's electric.
So good. Amazing.
It's engaged, and it feels like Genesis is almost like renewed, like, and Then There Were Three was like, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we want to do. Here's the plan. And then it seems like Duke is kind of like the execution of the plan. And then Abacab is the plan refined. Like, I think Duke is kind of like the warm-up act almost for Abacab, because they really do go hand in hand really well. But there is a different energy that wasn't there before. And it might be some of the production of, but there's a pop. What I mean, not pop music, but a pop in the music. It's just kind of a little bit more like excited and energized, Chris.
Well, I mean, I think part of that is, there's a few things going on there. First of all, like what Eric said about lyrically and thematically, like the thing I kept thinking about is that, Phil Collins went to Vancouver before the making of this record to try and piece things together with his wife, and it kind of fell apart, and he's alone in his house in Surrey in England. And I think when you have songs like Alone Again and Misunderstanding, it's him kind of working out everything that happened with his wife. But at the same time, while that was going on, the band also said, well, let's take a break and take 8 months where we're away from each other. So they all had time to write, and that's where Phil Collins figures out his ability to write. But they also, in some sense, come back to Genesis with a sense of renewal, or a sense of being refreshed. And I think there was a much more upbeat energy when they made Duke than it was when they made And Then There Were Three. And I also think that idea of like moving away from the past and not wanting the Duke suite to, call back to things like Supper's Ready or the record Foxtrot, where it's one long song and a few smaller ones, I think was really kind of brilliant. And those songs still retain, whatever prog elements that you want to take on, but I also think they work better separated. Like I'm sure it would have sounded a little different, but the nerd that I am, I went and I actually played the Duke Suite the way the Duke Suite was original, and it doesn't work as well as the sequence of the record, the way the sequence of the record actually was released. So I definitely think it's cool.
But when they first, I think it was even before the album came out, when they went out on tour for this record, they would do the Duke Suite. They would do it as it was, meant to be. Right. So that's an interesting thing. If you can look it up on YouTube. So the performances are there.
As the form that they were working on it at the time.
Right.
Like they're road testing it of like, here's what it's going to sound like.
Phil would present this long monologue about so it's the story of Albert, who was the supposed character that you see, which is, I think it's a French comic or something that they based
Yeah,
the album cover on. Yeah.
There's a guy who wrote children's books or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So they really like the artwork. So I don't think that's, necessarily a thing or to make it a concept. But like what Chris was saying, like with songs like Please Don't Ask, and, Phil, really putting his heart on his sleeve there. That was a letter. That was the first song he ever wrote. It was meant to be on face value, but it was too many ballads on that record already. And Tony really liked the song. So the story goes is that he also, Tony maintains that Phil never played him In the Air Tonight. And Phil swears up and down that he did. Yep. And he goes, but Tony's like, if I had heard that, we would have used it. And I think that kind of, that's where Mama comes into play. Like, like later on, they would do a song very similar to that. But because they didn't get to do that, at first. But, yeah. But I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say, to his credit, though, he'll also say that if they got In the Air Tonight, they would have Genesis'd it, and it wouldn't have been as cool as the one that Phil Collins.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's go there, because Behind the Lines that opens up this album, Phil Collins took it wholesale. Well, not wholesale. He took the song wholesale and re-recorded it for his solo album, and it's a totally different
vibe.
Different song.
It's like a funk song, right?
The vibe, yeah, it's funkier. He's indulging himself with the horns. He's really kind of letting his influences, it shows. It really shows you how one song could be two totally different things.
Yeah,
in the hands of a group or someone pulling that out, and that was written by all three of them. So it wasn't like this was a Phil Collins song, and kind of like, it was like this was a Genesis song that they wrote, and Phil's like, well, I want to tinker with this a little bit and fool around with this idea, because
interestingly enough, they were listening to some of the playback, and I think the idea came when they played back the tape, it was on it was like higher speed, so it was faster. And I think if you listen to the song, I mean, the song is pretty brassy, what Tony's doing with the keyboard. So when it's sped up, that I think that's where Phil kind of might have gotten the idea of, let's use horns. This is cool. Like he liked the way it sounded. So,
it's much snappier. It's a snappier version on
and him being a big fan of big band jazz anyway. So that's where that stuff came into play. So I think, so one thing inspires another, and like Chris was saying, when they went off and did their own thing, how many bands do you know can do that? Can go off and I'm disillusioned with the band, I got to do my own thing, and then come back and want to be with each other and inspire them to do and collaborate and play more. I can't think of a lot of bands that have that. Genesis was, I think, unique in that. That way.
I think making it a trio makes it easier also, because you don't have too many cooks. Everybody wants to be a chief, right? And I think that when you have down to three people, it's easy to sit there across from each other and kind of bounce those ideas off, and especially since none of these guys were the front man at the time, it made it easier also, because it wasn't like, I'm the front. I've always been the front man, and then there's two other guys left, so I naturally am going to want to do what I want to do. So let's talk. There were two singles released. I mean, let's talk about it. We've talked about Misunderstanding, Eric, a lot.
Yeah.
Where and you mentioned usually Hot Fun in the Summertime is kind of a
Family Stone. Check that
song out.
I
never thought about that. Yeah, that's true.
There are two other songs that have DNA in there as well. One is our beloved Beach Boys, the song Sail On Sailor.
Yep.
And then oddly enough, Toto, Hold the Line. It's got a little, they took a little.
The riff is similar. Yeah.
Phil even cited Rocky Mountain Way too. Yeah. Joe Walsh has that, that kind of
a lot in there. Yeah. And then you have Turn It On Again, which like I said, is kind of they're always their opener. The thing I noticed about those two songs, and maybe why they're so popular, is they both have a repeating riff that really make it easy to kind of hang your pop hook onto it, right? Misunderstanding, it's just got that repeating riff, but then, like we said, Mike Rutherford throws some little bit, like he throws those little bass flourishes, and that's where Chris, makes his point that the guy is, and we said it on Abacab, I was gobsmacked. I'm like, I never I never really heard the bass playing of Mike Rutherford before on Abacab until I listened to the remaster. And right, Eric, I was like taken aback. I was like, holy shit. Like this was amazing. And now that I know that, I can now go forward and listen for it. And it's not as prevalent, but it is very much present that Mike Rutherford is very formidable, which makes it, which almost, this is going to be a bold statement, but it gives it that McCartney angle where he's thinking about bass lines, but then he's also able to also throw the guitar in and kind of, as one player, he's kind of playing off himself. He's able to kind of come up with the bass lines and then figure out where he wants to insert the guitar. If he wants to double, if he wants some little flourishes, he can kind of, he doesn't have to discuss it. He can kind of work on both at the same time and say, okay, well, here's my bass line or here's my guitar. And then I'm going to fit the bass in there, Chris.
There's also that element of like the idea of like, well, it's not a guitar player competing with a bass player for sounds in the mix because he's competing with himself. Yeah. So he knows what he's doing on the, so it's not like he needs to like have his ego stroked because he's not going to say, well, somebody.
Turn up the bass. He can say turn up both.
Right. And what I love about my favorite thing about Turn It On Again is that the time signature for such a, what would be like a pop rock song, the time signature is like really odd. It's like something like 13/8.
Yeah.
And you don't really notice it until you start to like tap along with the beat. And then my other favorite story about this record and that song is that Phil Collins, I guess in 1980 was recognized as like drummer of the year in some readers poll.
Yeah.
And John Bonham, I guess, had a problem with it. So his son, Jason, who was only like 13 or 14 at the time, learned how to play that song. He like put it on his jukebox and just kept having his son rehearse it until he got it perfectly. And he went, my 12-year-old son can do it. I don't understand why they're making such a big deal about this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, there's also another story where when they played that show, that one-off show, Milton Keynes for Peter Gabriel.
Six of the best.
The Six of the Best. While they did that song, because they were doing several songs from Abacab. You could just imagine that they're doing songs from The Lamb with Peter Gabriel, but he's also like playing along to Turn It On Again. He sat down at the kit and tried to play the beat, and he kept missing that one part of the beat where it's like, and like he was playing it all wrong, and it totally threw everybody off. And it was just, so, and Pete, he fancied himself a drummer before he became the artiste, but yeah, it's just so interesting. Very, but he had a lot of respect, seems easy, but it's not, it's like, and that was Phil. He could throw those things in there, So.
Yeah, I think Gabriel, if I recall, walked away kind of impressed. He goes, "Yeah, this is kind of not." He thought he was going to sit down and just kind of slam dunk it. Yeah. And he goes, "This is a little more intricate than I thought, and I wasn't prepared for them to be kind of, not that they couldn't do it, but wasn't prepared for that kind of stuff to be thrown in." But I think now's a good time to probably talk about this. Is it seems like the tides are turning with Phil Collins. Is that much like most artists, he's starting to come full circle, where he went from being very derided and blasted for, the stuff that he did to now, I think there's a documentary coming out, or if it's not out yet,
comes out tomorrow,
he's getting his due for the drum work that he did, which got overshadowed in the 80s and the 90s. Like Phil Collins, the character, started to overshadow Phil Collins, the artist. And now people are starting to recognize and going back and appreciate Phil Collins, the artist. And I think that's where, where we find Genesis in 1980 is still that era where he wasn't a household name. So he was able to kind of do the things he wanted to do, be experimental, really do it without having the Phil Collins name attributed to it.
Yeah, I was very, very grateful to have gotten into Genesis at that point because I've totally appreciated that about him. It's what got me into him is his drumming. Even then, it was like, and listening to this album and the stuff he does on Face Value, and you go back and of course you're listening to the older stuff and you're like, holy shit, like especially the live albums too, like Seconds Out. I think is one of my all-time favorite live albums
Such a
ever.
Great record.
And he does the old stuff so well. He sings it well. He's there with, both Bill Bruford is on that record and Chester Thompson. And it's like, you can't even distinguish who's who, because just Phil was like really there with both of them. These guys are like, these are like some of the finest jazz fusion type players in the business. And Phil was right up there, and he was just totally unappreciated for his time. And I'm really glad that he's getting his due, as far as that concern,
And to that point, I was definitely I was one of those people that knew about Phil Collins in the 80s, like all that schmaltzy, like 80s stuff, like and that just wasn't my bag. And I really didn't truly get, like, everybody, Phil Collins was a drummer. He played with Led Zeppelin at Live Aid, and he was the drummer in Genesis before I really knew who Genesis was. I remember when we reopened the college radio station at St. Thomas Aquinas, somebody had a copy of Genesis Live. It was the first time I ever heard The Knife. When I heard what he did, that's when I really truly understood what a monster he was. And then going through all the other records and truly listening to what he does as a drummer, it really is. It's good that finally people are starting to figure out this guy really was a monster on the kit. What's unfortunate is if you watch some of the previews for this documentary that Drumeo is putting out tomorrow, the man can barely move now. Yeah. It's really sad that people are finally giving him his due as a musician. And he can't play anymore.
Sad how old and frail he looks, and he's only like
looks like my grandfather.
Yeah,
he's not that old
because he gave it his all. I mean, I was fortunate with Eric to see Genesis and then Phil Collins. The Genesis self-titled album tour, and then Phil Collins' No Jacket Required. And the guy was a beast. Oh, wow. I mean, he was constantly working. I mean, if he wasn't running around the stage, if he wasn't singing, it wasn't getting behind the kit. I mean, he really, unfortunately today, if you go on social media, it's the drum fill from In the Air Tonight that people, it's kind of a meme, and there was so much more. It was a blessing and a curse, because that kind of, became one of the most iconic drum fills ever. But then it also kind of became the thing that people kind of they meme it, where there was so much more to what he was doing. He can play. He can play with finesse. Also, he's not just the big bombastic hitting. Those big sounding drums. It's a part of it, and it became more a part of it as it went on.
Yeah,
but there was that he has the gentleness. If you listen to Face Value, that one song is mainly In the Air Tonight is that. But the rest of the album is very pulled back. Dare I say, I want to use the word tasteful. I don't want to say that In the Air Tonight is not tasteful, but he knows what he's doing. He's a musician, and he
serves the song. Yeah,
he knows exactly what it needs. And on Duke, I think that's, and that comes from the prog too, right, Eric? I mean, the prog is the bombast, right? The prog is the big stuff, the big sounds that are going on. So coming from that, and then transitioning into a more pop oriented thing, that's a challenge in and of itself, to kind of consciously pull back that stuff that you're used to just letting it rip and letting it go for days on end.
I totally agree. And the thing about Genesis, though, for me as a prog band, was they require a tremendous amount of patience, because their stuff is not hitting you right in the face from the get-go.
Not at all.
Okay, so if you listen to a band like Yes or Rush or these guys, what you're getting, right? I mean, the instrumentation, the sort of, like, these guys are all virtuosos. Genesis always came from the standpoint of the songwriting, of the composing, of the slow builds to this, tremendous crescendos and these sort of almost biblical type stuff, with the lights and like the keyboards, like, even on this album with Duke's Travels, when he reprises guide vocal, I'm tears come to my, because it's so, when you listen to that really loud and with headphones, I'm like, I'm crying, so because good. It's just so, like, and I think of Phil as he is now, and it makes me so sad, it's just,
it really is sad,
and I think back to those days when we saw him, and I couldn't bring myself to see him on this last tour, even though as much as I wanted to say goodbye, because I knew this was the last, but I just couldn't do it. I would have been, I don't know. I just don't know how I would have felt, so just,
here's what I think. I think here's what should happen with Phil Collins.
Yeah.
Forget about drumming. He should spend his time working with a vocal coach. And kind of refine the strength in his voice, because that's going to be the thing. Calling All Stations should not be the final studio album from Genesis. It should not be with that guy. I think they should make one studio album to get and with no intent on touring, but really get Phil Collins powered up vocally, because he still has the ability to do that and still has the ability to write songs.
Yeah.
And get Genesis to release one album, a strong album, not with the intent on cashing in on touring, but to close the book on Genesis. I think that would be the right way to do it, because he can still sing, but I think if he works with a vocal coach just to get that strong, get it pumped up so you can really kind of deliver one last album of just kind of really great stuff. I think they have it in them. I know, but Banks and Rutherford certainly do. So I think Phil is probably probably some form of depression, or I'm just armchair psychology here, but I think he can do it. I think there's one in there.
His voice got very weak only because he's like deaf in one ear.
Yeah,
he actually, that's something that nobody really talks about as much as the nerve damage that he got just by playing the drums a certain way over the years, and just that, to me, it blows my mind that why isn't every drummer like that? Because you sit a certain way. How do you? And these are guys that are doing it full time. Phil wasn't doing it full time, and that
might be the problem, is that he was going from like 0 to 100. Like Mike Portnoy, who is actually in the documentary, and love or hate Dream Theater, he's a monster musician. He attributes the fact that he's still able to play at the level he plays at 57 years old is because he's constantly playing. He never. If anybody knows anything about him, he's constantly working in like 100 different projects. He's always drumming. So I wonder if that has anything to do with it, is that he was going from not doing anything to playing the drums, not doing it. Like, maybe that contributed to it in some respects.
Yeah, it depends on what his regimen is too for Phil Collins. Like, does he practice? Does he keep up? Or does he just kind of play when he needs to play, knowing that he can rely on his
without
skill
any warm-up?
To kind of do it, and put his body through that. Yeah, because he's then he gets up off the kit and then he runs to the front of the stage. I mean, we saw, like I said, Eric, when we saw him, just like it was, it was off the charts, what was going on, getting back to Duke. Let's get back to Duke a little bit.
Okay.
Is that why we're here?
Please don't ask.
Oh, good one. Yeah, there you go.
I caught that.
Yeah. Like I said, I think as a precursor to Abacab, for me, that's how this fits, because you have stuff like Man of Our Times that it very much, for me, connects to the sound that they were kind of getting going forward. So the stuff like Duke's Travels and Duke's End, I think, are outliers. I think that's the vestiges of the old stuff, although they would always put like some proggy instrumentals, they would indulge in that. But I think this, this one is kind of putting a cap on it in a way. They wouldn't get as, not that it wasn't adventurous, because you'd have like Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea, and they would do those kind of things. But I think this kind of, the way they close out the album with it is kind of this majesty, and it kind of, opens with Behind the Lines, and then Duke's End kind of recalls Behind the Lines, and it kind of closes out like the whole. So it's not really a concept album, but it's kind of like a concept experience that you're getting, right? You're kind of, the album is kind of opening, and then it kind of closes with the same type of thing, and the same crescendo. And the same energy that it opened with is what you're closing it with. You're not closing it on a ballad, or kind of walking out the door gently. You're kind of giving this grandiose Duke's Travels experience, and then you're recalling the beginning of the album.
Yeah. I
think.
Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead, Eric. No. Go ahead, Eric. I'm sorry.
Wow, you guys are so polite to each other.
We are.
I've never said that to me.
That's because you're the no. I totally agree. But like I said before, I think that the sadness of the record, the melancholy nature of it, is what gets me. And and this is one of there aren't many Genesis albums that really evoke that kind of emotion. Because they're just basically, there's a lot of stuff that they're just putting out there that is, dare I say, complete nonsense. You listen to Abacab, and it's like there's nothing on that album that really,
hey, go easy.
That you could, that you can, I love Abacab, don't get me wrong, but to me, it's more of an experiment. They were experimenting with new sound. This was the promise fulfilled, because they're basically saying on Duke, we're changing. Mm-hmm. Now they had to have made an album. The follow-up had to be so different and such that, to me, so there's that crossover. And then you get to the 83 album, which to me, they really refined that pop sound in the songs. The songs are well-crafted pop songs. Like that's a great song. I mean, it's not the Genesis you knew, but I still say, to me, it's like a Beatles song in that regard. I would hearken back to the way it, just, I don't know, just the overall, like the chemistry was there, I feel. And it might be like the last, pretty, for me, the last really good album before Invisible Touch, which, they really leaned into wanting to make. At this point, Phil was a superstar. Tony and Mike wanted a piece of that. Let's say, hey, let's do something there. There you go. That's Invisible Touch. So
since you brought up That's All, before I kick it to Chris,
yeah,
do we want to bring up my fashion style around that time? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Did you try to look like Phil Collins?
I don't know if we'll ever do.
I think we both did. We both had
about.
We had the hats. We would walk around with the hats.
A jacket with clothespins in it.
Clothespins, and people were like, "What the?"
They were dressed like bums, and they're wearing like jackets with clothespins. Like they stole it like off the line while it was drying. So part of my thing, my style was I used to wear, like when I wore like my jacket, like outdoor jacket, had the clothespins like on the thing, like it was taken right off the line.
I don't feel so bad about my mullet anymore.
There's so many fashion sins committed.
I've been there. I've been there.
But you know what? You know what? When he was saying That's All, that like that to me, that brings back that era of when I was totally in
MTV. I mean, MTV played a huge role in the direction of the band as well. I mean, he
leaned into that, the goofiness, and
it was so weird to see them actually act as guest hosts on this thing, right? They would never do things like that back in the day. You know what I mean? So here they are, like now they were like the Police, where we're popular, and they were loving it. They, and why not? That's for me, it's like, why not? The fact that they did what they did in hindsight now, that stuff might have been there was a point, where I just completely hated the later stuff and just, but now I don't mind it. I just love the fact that it's the same band, and all this music is under one roof. It's like a big umbrella, and you got all this great, tremendous amount of music, whether love it or hate it. Some of it's great, some of it's not so great, but the idea of this band transitioning to that is, and then you count all the Steve Hackett albums that he put out. How many albums? He's got more solo albums than all of them combined.
Even now, but I mean, some of them are really, really good. Like the first, I forget the name of the first one, but it's got like
the Voyage of the
Acolyte.
But Voyage of the Acolyte. But then there's another one that he put out where it had what the heck, the lead singer from Kansas and Richie Havens, and like that's a great record. Like there's not a bad Steve Hackett. Like I've never really listened to a Steve Hackett record and said, oh my God, this is shit. Like he's consistently put out good stuff. And I guess that's what it was. It's almost like a George Harrison kind of thing. Like, I just don't have the forum to do what I want to do because I have to share with these three other guys. And I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, he wanted the Prog. Like he wanted that stuff. He goes, I want to explore those ideas. That's what I joined Genesis for, was to do that.
And he fucking owns it to this day. He owns it.
Oh my God.
I've
so good live.
Yeah.
And then of course, Peter Gabriel, for me, I prefer his solo work over his time with Genesis. I mean, that's saying a lot, not necessarily in the songwriting and whatever, but just in the overall, I think his voice is stronger now. I love the stuff that he's doing, the experimental nature of it, the art rock nature of it. And again, you have all of that as part of it as well. And it's just,
I think it was a win-win. I think it allowed Gabriel to get out of the shackles of that as well, of having to dress up and do all that kind of stuff. And he was probably limited, and it freed Genesis. Now let me throw this out to Chris, because what I wrote that what Duke did is Duke created a permission structure for the group to move away from the prog-centric music. I think that's what they were doing, is kind of like, giving enough nods to the prog stuff, but also kind of saying, well, here, like you said, the Hinge album, like, here's where we're going to start to kind of, things are going to start to turn a little bit, and we're not going to go full, we're not going to just do a 180, but we're going to kind of start to tilt the seesaw a little bit. And here's where we're letting you know, kind of almost like serving notice. Like, hey, we're kind of giving you notice that, things are going to be different here. They did it a little bit, and then there were three, but Duke, I think is really what kind of stands out. Cause then after this, it was full on.
Yeah. I think that's fair. But I also think you do in previous record. I guess from the time, like, even like you listen to some of the songs on, Trick of the Tail, like Robbery, Assault and Battery, or you've got Follow You, Follow Me on, and then there were three, and then there are some ballady type songs in Wind and Wuthering. I think I don't necessarily think it was a conscious decision that this is the end of prog Genesis as we know it, but if you listen to the records as they progress, going back to like, I'm thinking that if you go from Trespass up through their career, it's very subtle as you go through each one that they're moving in this direction. And this is where a lot of prog fans are like, this is where I get off, because after this is where they really kind of go completely. And, then that, and to that point, like, I remember I was talking to my old man about it. He goes, that's the last prog record. He goes, or this is where they go pop. Like that was his response to me when I told him we were doing this album. So
yeah, but goddamn, is Abacab a great album?
I got it. You know what? That's one of those records I really do need to listen to.
Right after this on Spotify, like it just started playing because it was in order.
Yeah,
I'm not turning it off. I should listen to Duke again, but I'm not turning it off. I'm sorry, can't do it.
I love Abacab. I do, and I've grown to love the '83 album as well. I mean, that to me was a step down, but no, I think I don't know what it is about that record. I just love the sound of it. I love songs like. It's going to get better.
Save it, because maybe we will do a
perhaps that's down the road, but that's a great. I don't know. It's just a great, but
And then the other thing that I find interesting about it is that as Phil Collins came into his own, he was almost the hardest one to like fill the shoes of when he left, because Ray Wilson really is a great singer. If you really want to hear how phenomenal a singer Ray Wilson is, Steve Hackett did a live record at the Royal Albert Hall, and he comes out and sings "The Carpet Crawlers," which was a Peter Gabriel era song from "The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway." That is my favorite version of that song, because he annihilates that vocal. It's phenomenal what he does. But to all the stuff he did on, the things Phil did on MTV, like, the Jesus He Knows Me video where he dresses like a Bible thumping preacher. And, he was a little bit more of a character and almost like a comedian, like in some respects, like who's going to replace that? Like, as he came into his own after Duke, he became very hard to, those shoes became almost impossible to fill.
Yeah. And unfortunately, Tony and Mike were in that shadow as well. He kind of, and that's where a lot of fans say, like, oh, it's Phil Collins ruined Genesis, but Tony and Mike were writing pop songs as well. Mike went off and did a Mike and the Mechanics, which is a pop band.
Yeah, so they were is like the saddest song ever about, right?
Oh my God, it's so upset. That's
like everybody plays that at their father's funeral. So these guys, it's easy. It's easy to pin it on Phil Collins because he was the front man. And he was doing Miami Vice. He was doing anything that got thrown his way. And we talked about that in past episodes as well. We can look back and make decisions about it. Whether they should have continued, I was reading about Calling All Stations, and they thought
I got to listen to that record too.
They thought it would be a good idea. I didn't listen to it, but the tour
There's some good stuff on there.
Like they had the UK tour or the Europe tour booked, and then the United States tour, and then the United States tour wasn't selling, so they're like, "Oh, we'll go to smaller venues," and that wasn't selling, and they just canceled the whole thing.
What hurt that era too is that I think Chester Thompson and Daryl Stromer wanted to be
they were with Phil's
full-fledged members, and they bailed. and which is unfortunate too. I mean, I don't know how many people that turned off, but the guy who played drums on that tour, Nick DiVirgilio, is a phenomenal drummer. So like, I guess it just was as great as the elements seemed to be. It just, again, Phil left and like the balloon deflated for
people
varying
like,
reasons.
Collins,
but,
I'm not going.
Right.
Well, Tony and Mike, I think for that to be fair for that album, there's some good stuff on there.
Yeah.
But they were trying to get back to that sort of Prog feel, a modern Prog sound, if you will. But it just didn't quite work. And indeed, there's actually songs on We Can't Dance. There's songs like Fading Lights, I think it's a great song. Songs like Driving the Last Spike, which was Phil writing a long song. This was his first attempt to write a long song, and I absolutely love that song. I think he does a great job. But you also have, I Can't Dance was one of the worst. I mean, they're trying too hard to kind of bring back what they were, and it didn't quite work. After the mammoth success of Invisible Touch. Which I fucking hate that album. I just cannot stand that. Right. Yeah. That's the one that for me,
go ahead and cross that off.
And I think when people think of post Duke Genesis, they don't think of the Abacabs and the self-titles. They think of Invisible Touch.
Yeah, they
and
skip
I think
over that because that was kind of,
right.
Kind of warming up to it. But all right, let's wind down here. Let's go with as we do with a couple of top tracks. Chris, what do you have for the what are the keepers? This one for you.
But for me, Behind the Lines might be one of my top 5. As much as I love the 70s era Genesis, Behind the Lines is probably one of my top 5 Genesis songs of all time. I know Turn It On Again is the one everybody knows. That's one of my favorites. But what I really came to love on this record is, and it's probably more of a pop song than anything else, I love Alone Again, and Duchess is amazing. Just I love the way Duchess feeds in from Behind the Lines, and it's just a phenomenal song.
Cool.
Yeah.
Eric?
Duchess, what I love about Duchess is the fact that you have this, like Tony's playing Mellotron on this, but there's a drum machine to it. This is the first time Phil would use that drum machine. This is before In the Air Tonight. So it didn't start there. It started in this, both on the Peter Gabriel's third album and this, right there. So I love that. And I love like I said, the build of this song. That's one of my favorites. I adore Heat Haze by Tony. I think that's one of his best songs ever. I love the emotive vocal by Phil. And one of the things about this remaster is how they were able to isolate Phil's vocal a little bit more. It almost made me think that he, I was like, did he re-record his vocals on this record? Because it doesn't, there's a lot of double tracking of his vocals on the original. And I think they really kind of pulled that out and isolated it. And I just love how naked his vocal is on this song. And I think it's a beautiful song. And then, of course, the end, the Duke's Travels is the drums on that thing, and of course,
so
when Phil comes in with that, and his vocal on that as well is just, it's not that vocal that you hear in the 80s, but it's something, but emotive, and it just oh God, yeah, it gives me chills. So there you go. I'm
going to go with Man of Our Times. Which
I knew you would like that song. I don't know why, but I knew that was going to be the one for you.
It's got that Phil vocal, that kind of impassioned, strong vocal from him, which I kind of like. Misunderstanding, I'm always going to go to. I don't ever get tired of hearing that. Whenever it comes on my Spotify thing, it's like I'm not going anywhere. I'm leaving it on because it's just it's like a perfect pop song. It's got a hook. It keeps repeating it. It's interesting. It's got enough in there. There's just, it kind of is like, almost like Genesis was like, probably like this right here. This is what we want. Like, here it is, like, misunderstand. This is it, and then I'd go with Alone Tonight, taking out Turn It On Again, which I would pick, but Alone Tonight also. Yeah. I think there's, there's enough on here. If you're not a prog person, I could see there. It could be a little tough, but it's not hard. It's not that bad. I think this is like I said, this is the one where there's they're kind of starting to put it in the rearview mirror, like the really indulgent and the crazy stuff and the fantastical stuff and the long-winded stuff like that. That's gone. They've disavowed it. We're not doing that. That's not our thing anymore. So I think if you like the Invisible Touch and you like the Phil Collins solo stuff, I think Duke fits in there. It's kind of like the early ideas, and you can hear the sprouts of the ideas that would become Abacab and the sprouts of the ideas that Phil would take into face value. He was writing those songs simultaneously. So this is all like one melting pot. It's just like some of the portion went here, some of the portion went here. Is really what it was. That so some of it got Genesis-fied, and then some of it was Phil Collins-ified. And that's all there is to it. It wasn't like he had an epiphany and started writing differently. He was just writing, and it depends on what was being done with the material. So,
and please don't ask. I have to throw that one in there too because I love that one. I always have. It's my favorite ballad by him, and because it's just so honest. Because it was basically just a love letter to his wife, and he just wrote a song. There it is. That's the start of me being a songwriter. I want to ask you, Dean, like I'm surprised. I'm not surprised that you picked those songs because I kind of equate this album as the most ELO-ish album. Would you agree with that in terms of like Alone Tonight, like the way those ballads sort of build and you got those like big choruses and you got, the sort of, not necessarily they sound alike, but I'm just saying like it's the most sort of album that you could gravitate towards because of your love for ELO and the things that you love about.
I'll make two statements.
Okay.
About that. One, when I listen to Genesis, I'm not trying to hear anything else. So I'm not listening because Genesis is to me, Genesis is Genesis. Okay. I don't really listen for anything else or hear anything else, to be honest. Rarely. Mm-hmm. Second statement, if I want to hear something from this era that reminds me of ELO, I'll put on Long Distance Voyager by the Moody Blues. If I want to hear ELO that's not ELO, it's Long Distance Voyager. And Chris, if you've never listened to that album,
I usually go to the 60s with Moody Blues.
What's that?
I said I usually go to the 60s when I listen to the Moody Blues.
Yeah, we're gonna do Long Distance Voyager. So if you want to listen to
great album,
like here's the Moody Blues trying to cash in on ELO, which is probably why I love that album so much because it's like it's kind of like I get an extra ELO album without having to
and you're not the only one. I mean, I've talked to people that don't know anything about ELO or the Moody Blues, and they could swear that the voice was ELO. Like, that ELO song. I'm like, that's not the ELO. That's the
it is.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're close, but no cigar. Final thoughts, Chris. On final thoughts on Duke. What do you got? We're gonna.
I think Duke. I mean, I think Duke is a great record. Like I said, I think it really is. If you're looking to get into Genesis, it's a good starting point. And if you're pop leaning, if you're more of a pop or 80s sounding leaning person, you're going to move forward. And if you're it's easy to move forward. But if you're also into that proggy stuff of the 70s, it's easy to move back. I also think in some respects, it's very of its time insofar as that a lot of the prog bands were starting to move in this direction as well. So kind of like we've been there, done that. So we're going to try something new. It's when you have Drama from Yes coming a little more streamlined, and you have this, and you have, Permanent Waves by Rush came out that year. So I while it's uniquely Genesis, the idea of the bombast of the 70s is starting to move away. And I think that makes it of its time.
Yeah. And we've had that, Eric and I have tossed that around briefly is by its nature, does prog just have a short fuse? Is it inevitable that these bands just say we need to make shorter songs? Because it seems like every time we've done something like that, that's what these bands inevitably do. Rush did the same thing. We want to get the point across with a shorter song. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, conversation for another time. Eric, close.
Okay, sure.
I left. I'm sure Chris probably had a lot to say about that.
No. I would have. We could do.
We would have been here another.
Yeah, and I'm sure Eric would have fed off anything that I said. So.
Of course.
So I dropped that firecracker in his lap, and we're going to let the fuse burn out. And
that's fine.
So, Eric, final thoughts as we duked it out today.
An absolute, for me, a masterpiece. I just think it's grown. Like I said, it's grown in the ranks of albums, and and I always kept it like just only because of the production. It's not what the songs. I just never really cared, and never really. It wasn't Abacab. It wasn't. It didn't have that sound. But now I totally appreciate it. Or not now, but even ever since the remaster, which was 2007, I've always loved it, and it's one of my very favorite albums by them. Might be, I think I could probably say without hesitation that it could be the best album from the Phil Collins era.
Wow, bold statement.
Yeah.
In closing, I think I'll put it this way. It's got 3 very recognizable songs on it. 3, 2 of them are certified radio hits, and 1 is kind of a concert staple. But I still think this album is the kind of like the underdog Genesis album from that era. Most people like, and then there were 3 is kind of them kind of spiral, figuring out what they're going to do. It's kind of like, we're all of a sudden we're a trio. And then I think Duke kind of sets the plan in motion. And I think that's why it's kind of an underdog, because Phil Collins would become so big solo, Abacab would come out with Man on the Corner and No Reply. There was so much, like literally vaulting into the 80s on those 2 albums. And Duke is behind the scenes, just kind of like, I'm here too, don't forget about me. And that's the way I think about Duke. Is it's kind of like it's almost like the redheaded stepchild of their 80s output, because everything else was so much bigger, and everybody kind of reveres everything after this album, right? Everyone talks about from face value on is where people assume things start, but Duke really kind of started off their 80s output, and I think it's an important part of the equation for people to listen to, even if you give it a cursory listen. Like I said, if you're listening on Spotify, go for the 2007. I listened to the regular one a couple times before I realized it was a remaster, and I was like, oh shit, okay.
The only reason I knew about it was because of Eric, because I don't know why it doesn't pop up on Spotify automatically. But
they wouldn't serve you that. So that's going to do it for this episode of the 3324 podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. If you want to hit us up on social media, we're on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or within your app, you can actually send us a little note. We can't respond to it, but if you want to give us some feedback, we are always open to it. And our podcast is open 24/7. There's plenty of other material in the back room. You can go sort through it and find what you like. And certainly more to come on the front end in 2025. So, Mr. Christopher Clark, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, man. It's been good. And I just one last comment before I go. If anybody who really wants to check out the genius of Phil Collins, check out Drumeo did a documentary about him that came out this past December, and there's also another 15-minute video that talks about the genius of Phil Collins that breaks down the drumming on a lot of his songs. So if you're a drummer or a musician, check that stuff out. It's on YouTube.
Yeah, I'll close up by saying it's time to revisit Phil Collins, right? And I think that enough time has passed, and that's usually what has to happen. Is the dust needs to settle a little bit, and then a new generation of people that grew up on that are now artists, and they say, "Oh wow, he was so important to me." So I'm glad that wave is kind of coming back into shore. So that'll do it for that. And of course, Eric is going to be on his comfy couch, and I'll be on my 80s dentist office chair until we see you again. And so that's going to do it. So for Chris, for Eric, this is Dean. We will catch you on the flip side.
You've been listening to the 3324 podcast with Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider, so please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 podcast and on Twitter at 3324p to join the conversation.